Known by most people, Miss Gandhi was one of the most powerful women in the 20th century. She did not have a degree from an Ivy League school. She worked in a department store for her first job in the early 1900s. And then she became a file clerk, and she was eventually promoted to be the assistant to one of the, bring that down just a little bit on my mic, number 15. She got promoted all the way to be the assistant to one of the most powerful figures in American history. His name is J. Edgar Hoover. Miss Gandhi was his personal assistant. The reason that she was promoted to such a high and powerful position was because of her loyalty. In fact, when J. Edgar Hoover died, he instructed her to begin going through all of his things, and he trusted her to filter through all of his personal files. She spent about 2 weeks in his office after he passed away, going through all of his files. And when I say going through all of his files, that meant destroy everything. She was responsible for some of the biggest secrets in the United States. Miss Gandhi, her name was Helen Gandhi. So she was a great example of loyalty. It's not so much what her training was and who she was. It was because she developed such a strong relationship of trust and loyalty between her and another person. Open your Bibles this morning to the book of Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to see the importance of what Jesus is saying regarding our loyalty to God. And so notice with me in verse 19. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19 is where we'll begin. Jesus says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal." Look at verse 20. "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And so what Jesus is doing, He is following the same pattern that He has been following all throughout chapter 6. He says, do not do something. And then He says, this is what you should do. And then He gives us a concluding summary, profound statement. And you see that concluding summary statement found in verse 21. He says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." That is one of the three main points of our text today. The first thing I want you to notice is that Jesus is saying for you to have an undivided loyalty. An undivided loyalty between you and God, then you have to choose between two treasures. Notice what He says in verse 19. He is talking about a treasure that is upon the earth. And then also in verse 20, He's talking about a treasure in heaven. There are two treasures being spoken of, and the believer must decide which treasure he or she will choose. Notice how he is using this example from everyday life. It is possessions. Here is the concept that Jesus is teaching. Jesus is teaching that here is God, here is you, and you can't allow anything to get between you and God. It is a relationship that's based upon loyalty. Are you going to be loyal to God, Or are you going to let something get in between you and God in your relationship? In verses 19 through 21, he's using the example of treasures, of possessions, of material things. He also, if you'll notice, he doesn't just talk about cash, about coins. He talks about things. He says in verse 19, he says, don't lay up for your treasures, and that can be translated, stop doing this, or do not do this in the future. Either way you look at it, it is a prohibition that Jesus is giving. Jesus is saying, do not store up and hoard up for yourselves possessions and things on earth. He says, this is why, where moth and rust doth corrupt. We know that moth will attack clothing. In their day and age, they would take their clothing and they would put them in boxes and in closets and seal them up to keep the moths away from them. In their day and age, clothing was something of a probably much higher value than we place upon it. We, every now and again, probably almost everyone in here, every couple of years, we go through our closets and our drawers and we begin pulling out clothing that either is out of style or we've outgrown it, right? We've outgrown it right here. We're not growing up anymore, we're growing out and sideways. And so we go through our clothing, and what do? We put them in bags and boxes, and we take them to Goodwill or Habitat or Helping Hands or wherever you take your clothes to donate them. In that day and age, they didn't get rid of clothes. They wore them and wore them and wore them. And so clothing was something very valuable. He also mentions the fact of rust. And so probably talking about some kind of precious metal, some kind of silver or bronze or gold, some kind of metal where rust might attack it. Notice what he says, and he says the third thing, and where thieves break through and steal. And so if it's not enough to mention the moths and the rust, then these things are also susceptible to theft. But this is what he says. So these things on the earth are temporal. They waste away. They do not last. But he says this is the proper attitude of the child of God. This is where your mind must be. But instead, lay up for yourselves treasures, possessions, things of value upon earth, or in heaven. Not on earth, but in heaven. You say, well, how do I do that? What I want you to do, if you're still asking that question this evening or this afternoon or sometime in the near future, go back and read verses 1 through 18, because there Jesus tells you the things that you will be rewarded for by God. We can do a quick scan. If you'll notice in verse 1, he is talking about giving to people. And he said, if you do so with the wrong attitude, you will have no reward in heaven. And in verse 2, he talks about reward. In verse 4, he says that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. Just to cut to the chase, the things that he's talking about in verse 20 that we're supposed to lay up for ourselves in heaven, how do you do that? I mean, because you're sitting there thinking, I want to do this. First of all, you have to be generous, and you are going to be a giving person. Second of all, you're going to be praying to God. Notice in verse 6, but thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret. And thy Father which seeth in secret shall what? Reward thee openly. And so Jesus is just following up with what He has already taught them about reward from God. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Your prayers will not be eaten away by moths or rust, and thieves cannot take those away from you. Moths and rust and thieves cannot steal the generosity in your heart that God will reward you for. And the third example in 16 through 18 is that of fasting. And so all three of these things are examples that require a person to be totally obedient to God. There's nothing under the sun. If it has something to do with your love and devotion towards God, then that is a treasure in heaven that no moth, no rust, and no thief can take away. And so he's talking about your service to God and being totally obedient. Let me go back to the concept. Here is God, here is you, and it is a full devotion and entire loyalty between you and your Heavenly Father. Why is it important? Well, first of all, I've already mentioned, but in verse 20, where moth nor rust doth corrupt, those things are not in heaven. There's not deterioration, there's not decay, did you know there's no thieves in heaven? There's not going to be anyone stealing anything from you in heaven. So he's saying store up and hoard up those things which are going to be rewarded by God in heaven. And he gives us this concluding statement in verse 21. He says, "This is why, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And so in verse 21, the choice one makes of where you lay up your treasure is a result of the condition of your heart. Another way of saying it is this: the place of your investment will reveal the commitment of your heart. If you really are committed to serving God and loving God, and in verse 1 through 18 he tells you how to do it in the right way. There is a wrong way and a right way. The wrong way is to do so with selfish motives and desires. The right way is to do so because you have just a devotion for God and pure motives for God. And so he says, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. One will act and react to the other. If you have a desire to serve God and to not let anything get between you and God, you are going to be doing those obedient acts towards God, and that is an indication of where your heart truly is. Notice in verses 22 and 23, he gives a different example. He moves from two treasures that you must choose between, and now he's going to give you an example of two eyes. I already told Miss Wynema to don't think that it's talking about her here. Notice in verse 22, the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? And so you're going to have to think outside the box a little bit here with what Jesus is saying. He's not talking about the physiological function of an eye. Miss Grace just had eye surgery, and she was explaining to me some of the amazing things that they can do with the eye. But Jesus is not giving you a lesson on the lens and the cornea and the retina and all of these things about the eye. But He's using the eye as an example or a metaphor for what your focus is in life. He is saying this: imagine the eye as allowing light into the body. It is where your perception is and where your perspective is and what you view, what you're focused on. What are you driving for? You know, someone may say or use an expression that the Vice President has his eye on the White House. And what that means is that he has a goal of becoming president one day. And so here in verses 22 through 23, Jesus states a simple a truism is that the eye is the lamp of the body. Wherever your eye is focused, wherever your desires are focused, it is going to have an effect on the inside. A person who has a desire for more money, for more things, they are not allowing the light of God into their life, because here they've begun to let something come in between them and God. And so here he says, if your eye be single, by the way, that single eye, the word there is also used with a nuance of generosity in Romans chapter 12 and verse 8. We just looked at it a few weeks ago on Sunday night, and he's talking about giving. He's talking about being generous with someone. May I just summarize it in this way? He is saying that when your eye and perspective reflects the character of God, then you are letting the light of God flood your soul. Your whole inside is full of light when you have a desire for the things that God has a desire for. I promise you this, that God doesn't make it His life mission to get more money and to let money rule His life. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying here, is that possessions and money are not to dominate our lives and control us. How much can I play with money? How much can I let my mind and my life be consumed with money? Jesus says none at all. It doesn't mean, though, that it's a sin to have money, because on the other hand, God has blessed us with material things. But the lesson here is that we are not to allow it to dominate us and prohibit the light of God from coming into our lives. Did you know that you can reflect the light of God that is in you by being generous to other people, by showing compassion to other people? So here's the scenario. God has blessed you monetarily and financially, and then what do? Are you miserly? Are you like the Scrooge that hoards it all up for yourself? Or are you one who gives back and thanks God for it and tries to use the blessings that God has given you to further His work? And so notice, how far can I get with this? What can I do? Jesus says there's not really any wiggle room, because He says in verse 23, if thine eye be evil, and that's the opposite of single. We may say it like this. It is, single is synonymous with good and healthy, and evil is synonymous with duplicity. You know what a duplicitous person is. Someone who is duplicitous is a two-faced person. They have two sides. One day you'll be talking to them, and then when you walk away, they will go off and say something else out the other side of their mouth. We use that expression, they talk out both sides of their mouth. And so this person, they have an eye that works the same way. They have one eye on heaven and one eye on earth. And that is, Jesus says, there's no room for that, because if it's evil, if there's a dual nature going on, if you're duplicitous, if it's unhealthy, if it's bad, I'm verse 23, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. And so a little bit of darkness goes a long way. You'll notice that as the sun goes down at the end of the day, as the sun fades away, darkness creeps in, and eventually it is all dark. This is what he is saying is on the inside of a person. It is darkness and it is evil. He says, if therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, he says, how great is that darkness. But notice the third thing. He is going to give a comparison between two masters. Notice in verse 24, no man can serve two masters. Well, that's actually, if you're taking this over literally, you would argue with Jesus here. We're in fact going to be looking at a text in Acts chapter 16 where there was a little girl who had many masters. But Jesus has a point here, and I think that you'll understand what he means. He says, no man can serve two masters, and this is why. For either he will hate one and he will love the other, or he will hold to the one and he will despise the other. And then he finishes with a concluding statement. You cannot serve God and material things. Some of you are looking at that word mammon. It means materialism. Jesus is saying this, is that you are not going to be able to effectively serve God by God's demands when you are torn between two worlds. God demands loyalty, and He demands that you be loyal to Him. You cannot, God won't have it. Let me tell you who will tolerate it, is money. Money will allow you to try to serve it and try to serve God, but the problem with it is this. It's what does God think? Jesus said that you cannot serve two masters. What does it mean to serve money? What does it mean to serve God? Well, go back to the beginning of the text and where I was explaining to you that your heart cannot be divided. It can't be that you take money and allow it to come between you and God. Let me sum it all up like this. There's three big things going on here. You saw the two treasures, and then you saw the two eyes, and then you see the two masters here. Your choice between earthly and heavenly treasures will be determined by what you believe about eternal matters. If you don't believe that there is an eternity, if you don't believe that it doesn't matter what I do, that everything is temporal, then you're not going to embrace what Jesus is teaching here. Because what Jesus is presupposing is that you already have an understanding of eternity. Eternity is real, and what Jesus is saying in the treasures is, you can't take any of this on earth with you. Eternity matters, and it matters the most. But notice the second thing He is saying. He is not just talking about that eternal matters are real throughout the whole text. In the case of the two eyes, your choice between a healthy eye or a single eye and an unhealthy eye will be based upon the appraisal of the benefits. If you do not think that there is any benefit to being fully devoted to God, you're going to miss the point here. But Jesus is saying this is what God demands. God demands full loyalty and devotion to Him. And is it wrong to have things? No, but it's wrong to misuse things. And our attitude towards those things has to be in line with what God demands. God, I'll say it again, I've said it 10 times already, God demands our everything. God demands our all. There is no part-time with the Lord. It's always full-time devotion to God. God demands our loyalty. Notice again in verse 22, He says, if thy eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Light will flood your life and flood your soul because of a relationship with God. And the third thing is this, is your choice between two masters, and you see that money or material things is personified. You see that? It's like a servant or a slave that is owned by a slave owner. And are you going to be a servant to material things and obey Him? Or are you going to be a servant to God and obey Him? And so your choice between God or money will be based upon what is it worth to you. Is it worth it to serve God? Is it worth it to you to be devoted to God? Or can we just take a different approach and say, you know what, I'm going to love my money and I'm going to love the pleasures of this world and I'll worry about God later? Unfortunately, Jesus says that's not going to work. You cannot serve God and material things. You know, all of what is said here is not even relevant to you unless you first of all have a relationship with Christ. He is talking about the fact that that you would know something about eternity, that he's presupposing that you would even care about what he is saying. And quite honestly, unless you have been born again, you probably don't care. And so when you are born again, when you are saved, when you realize that Jesus died for me, and when you realize that you are in need of salvation, then your attitude will be changed and you will want to be devoted to your Father. I'm going to say something very, might be eye-opening to you, it might be surprising to you, but your Father in heaven is not your Father until you come through the Son. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no man comes to the Father except through me. And so you must be born again. And when you are born again, you begin to reflect the attributes and characteristics of your Father. You begin to be filled with the light of God, and then your whole perspective begins to change. You want to be totally loyal to God and devoted to Him, and begin using not just your material things with what Jesus is focusing on here, but also your whole self and your whole body. As you stand this morning, I want our musicians to come and prepare for a song of invitation. But a relationship with Jesus, let me say it one more time, it makes eternal matters real. It causes you to be a light and show love and generosity to others. And lastly, it moves you to serve God and stop serving everything else. Become a fully devoted to your Master which is in heaven as we sing a song of invitation.